Hi, I'm Susan Jabinsky with Morningstar. A standard bucket portfolio for retirees consists of 3 buckets, but some retirees might benefit from adding an extra bucket or two. Joining me today for a refresher on the bucket strategy and for whom a 4th bucket might be in order is Christine Benz. Christine's Morningstar's Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning, as well as host of the Longview podcast and author of a new book that's coming out this fall, How to Retire, 20 Lessons for a Happy, Successful, and Wealthy Retirement. Nice to see you, Christine.
Good to see you, Susan.
Okay, let's start with this bucket structure. Walk us through this. You often talk about it and write about it. It consists of 3 buckets. Go.
Right. So the basic idea is that you have this cash bucket that you're using to meet your near-term living expenses, maybe a couple of years worth of portfolio withdrawals in cash. That's bucket 1. Bucket 2 is taking a little bit more risk, not a lot. So that's primarily a high-quality short and intermediate term bond portfolio. And then bucket 3 is the growth engine of the whole thing. It's going to hold the remainder of the assets. So if you have 2 years worth of portfolio withdrawals in bucket 1 and maybe another 5 to 8 in bucket 2, everything else is going into that bucket 3 that's going to be primarily a globally diversified equity portfolio. It's where I would also hold other higher risk, higher return categories. So high yield bonds, potentially, if you wanted to hold them, or precious metals, which are volatile on a short-term basis. I'd keep them in my very long-term bucket. So that's the basic setup. I think it's an intuitive way to arrive at an appropriate asset allocation for retirement.
So for a lot of retirees, they can set up this bucket structure and kind of call it a day and just refill their buckets as time goes on. But you think there might be, for some retirees, a case for a 4th bucket. What is that bucket?
Right. This is something I've kind of played around with for the past several years. Might call it like a last call bucket. But the idea is that it's going to hold assets that aren't necessarily covered in those first 3 buckets. So a big category for many retirees is long-term care expenses. Many retirees do not have long-term care insurance, so will be self-funding long-term care expenses. That would be potentially something that could go into this bucket number 4, because you wouldn't want to use that for your spending until you absolutely needed it. If you didn't need the money for long-term care, you could use it if you had a very long life. So if you happen to live longer than the standard 25 or 30 years that we usually construct a retirement bucket portfolio for, if the last call bucket could encompass those funds. And then if you didn't deplete that bucket during your own lifetime, the assets could pass to heirs. So I think it's a nice way to kind of think about holding other assets that wouldn't necessarily be addressed by those first 3 buckets.
Now, you also say that it might be reasonable for some people, if they're inclined, to set up a separate, what you call, discretionary bucket. So talk about how that one would work, how a retiree might right-size how large that bucket should be, and what types of assets would go in something like that.
Yeah, in thinking about this, I was really influenced by talking to the financial planner, Jonathan Guyton, who uses something similar with his own clients. The basic idea is that he wants to empower them to direct their own discretionary spending. So for travel or for gifts to children or, paying for weddings or whatever the case may be, he doesn't want that to affect their annual spending. So they set up this discretionary bucket at the outset of retirement. Maybe it's for charitable giving during their lifetimes, for example. And I think it's kind of an elegant way to address the fact that many of these discretionary expenditures are lumpy. With travel spending in particular, we know that retirees tend to do their heavy travel oftentimes in the first 10 years of their retirement and may do much less travel later in retirement. The discretionary bucket really does help address those lumpy outlays. In terms of right-sizing it, I think since it would be money that would be carved off separate from the retirement spending portfolio, it really does make sense to put some pen to paper, think about how much you can afford to put into the discretionary bucket, and it seems like it would be very individual, household specific.
And then you also say that tax considerations might be another reason to set up distinct buckets. Talk about that.
Right. We often talk about this 3-bucket structure, but the fact is many of us are bringing in multiple tax silos when we enter retirement. So we might have traditional tax deferred accounts as well as taxable accounts as well as Roth accounts. And you probably, if you've done some work around how you plan to take withdrawals in retirement, you've probably have an idea of which of those silos you'll be spending from first. And that in turn, I think, could argue for having multiple buckets within each of those silos, unfortunately. So it gets a little bit more complicated, but think about your taxable bucket. It's oftentimes kind of front of the queue in terms of retirement spending. Well, maybe that just consists of bucket 1 and 2 assets because you'll spend through that in, say, the first 10 years of your retirement or whatever the case might be. So you would use your planned withdrawal sequencing to influence how many buckets you hold within each of those silos.
Well, Christine, thanks for your time today. This sounds like some interesting enhancements for some of us with those bucket strategies. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Susan.
I'm Susan Javinsky with Morningstar. Thanks for tuning in.